Today I'm going to talk about an underdog that deserves better, but first I need to explain some history. Britain at the start of the 20th century was simply put on top. We had the largest navy, the biggest empire, steam power unmatched. We had money, prosperity, and arguably most importantly, were the most industrialized country in Europe, only rivaled by the emerging beast that was America. And with both prosperity and industry comes great cars, and to put it simply, from around 1900 to about 1960, Britain had probably more car companies than any other. We had our big brands like Morris, Austin, and Rover, and we had luxury nailed down with Rolls, Daimler, Bentley, Jaguar, Armstrong Siddeley, and Aston Martin, as well as the sports car with MG, Triumph, Austin Healey, Fraser-Nash, Gilbern, TVR, Lotus, and AC. We also specialised in economy cars such as the now iconic Mini and the lesser known Hillman Imp. And these cars weren't just admired by us. Rolls-Royces were owned by a cast as diverse as Lenin, Mugabe, Maharajas, and kings. Even cars we consider today as a bit dull have illustrious pasts. For instance, Tsar Nicholas II, the last leader of Imperial Russia, grandson-in-law to Queen Victoria and cousin to both our King George V and Germany's last Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II, drove a Vauxhall. Yes, that's not a typo, a Vauxhall. In fact, he owned a fleet of them. The Romanovs had a collection of Vauxhalls. Our sports cars have climbed the same hills as everyone else's with the same brute force of any Italian, French or German mark. Enzo Ferrari owned 3 Mini Coopers. The Austin Healey set land speed records on the Bonneville Salt Flats, and the MG was the car that introduced America to the sports car. Austin's engineers taught Toyota its way around the toolbox, and well, in terms of winning, the sad passing of Sir Sterling Moss speaks for itself. In the areas of F1 we come first with 288 wins, in rallying we come fourth, and even in the American Indianapolis 500, we're first of the non-Americans. To put it simply, at one point in time we were up there with the best. So what happened? What happened? Well, British Leyland happened. But British Leyland, they had some good cars. Yeah, a couple. The Mini, the Spitfire, the XGS, the SD1. But to not get bogged down in politics and the details, British Leyland was let down by multiple factors. These range from poor management, poor quality, strikes and even government mismanagement. Which brings us to the subject of this video. Let me get one thing straight. While our so-called golden days were of yesteryear, we were poor. But arguably we were poorest in recent memory in terms of automotive history at 2 specific points. The 1957 Suez Crisis, which led to the invention of the Mini, and the 1970s fuel crises, which led to a demand of economy cars. And while the cars for the everyman like the Mini, the Imp, the Beetle, the Fiat 500 and the BMW Isetta ruled the 50s and 60s, and the Ford Fiesta, the Fiat 127, the Golf Mark I, and still the Mini ruled the 70s. While the whole of Britain was poor in the 70s, there was one group who had always been poor, and were about to get poorer: miners. Their industry slowly declined in the 70s, and many didn't have full driving licenses, but had motorcycle licenses instead. Which is where we come to the subject of our video, Reliant. In Britain, a law existed that went a bit like this. For some reason, if you had a motorcycle license, you could drive a three-wheeled vehicle. And in Tamworth in Stafford, when Raleigh decided to cease production of its three-wheel vans, T.L. Williams and E.S. Thompson, 2 works managers at Raleigh, decided to carry on. The miners were cold on their motorbikes, and so Reliant met demand by essentially building motorbikes with car bodies. As mentioned earlier, the 1970s fuel crises were devastating to consumers and manufacturers, but to Reliant it was a godsend, as it meant their fuel-efficient, cheap cars sold very well. For instance, the average Mini had a fuel consumption of 49 miles to the gallon and was praised in its day for doing so, but the Robin did 70 miles to the gallon. Now, Reliant is a car company unlike any other. It's best known by the name of one of its models, the Robin. And to be honest, the best known Robin, which is the Trotter van, isn't even a Robin. It's a Reliant Regal Supervan Mark III. In fact, no other car company is arguably so criminally unknown for the things it produced and achieved. So in this video, I'd like to show you how Reliant was bigger than the Robin. Let's look at the cars themselves. Reliants can be split into 2 categories, three-wheelers and four-wheeled cars. Freewheelers were Reliant's bread and butter, and essentially they just updated them every generation. First, we have the 7CTW, 8CTW and 10CTW, as well as the Regent. The CTW range obviously has motorcycle bloodlines, and you can clearly see that it's essentially a motorcycle with a box on top. There's only one video, so I'm sorry about that. There's some tuk-tuk footage because it supersedes that anyway, but I couldn't find any info on it except a production of 1935 to 1950 for the CTW, and for the Regent, which was essentially just an update, 1950 to 1956. The first one was built in T.L. Williams' garden, and production was halted due to the war. Now for the first iconic Reliant, the Regal. Arguably Reliant's most iconic car, and the one that made it into the expert in fiberglass and freewheelers that it became. The Mark I and Mark II were aluminium bodied, with the famous 330 and Supervan Mark III being made from fiberglass due to a price hike of aluminium in the 50s. The vehicle of choice for the boys at Trust's Independent Trading Co., it was built from 1953 to 1973 and was to become Reliant's starting point in terms of layout, engine and chassis for virtually every small car they made. The biggest engine it had was a 747 engine in the Mark I and Mark IIs, and a 701 Reliant engine built in-house in the iconic Regal 330 and Supervan Mark III. I also found this hilarious video of them rolling a chassis across the A5 because their factory was split across the two sides of the road, and apparently literally every single Reliant chassis was wheeled pretty dangerously across a main road. Like, they just literally went for it. It's hilarious. Next we have the TW9, or the Ant as it was better known. Built between 1967 and 1987, there's not much to say other than that it was pretty versatile and was so popular in Greece they built it under license by MEBA until 1995. The Robin. The best known of Reliant's ventures, the Robin has almost become a name ubiquitous with Reliance and freewheelers in general. It was so successful. There are a bunch of versions, here's a rundown. The Mark I, 1973 to 1982, it sold well due to fuel crises, top speed of 85 miles an hour with a 17 miles to the gallon and at top spec an 850cc engine. It was also built under license by MEBA and in India by Sunrise Automotive Industries Limited as the Badao. The Mark II, 1989 to 1998, it was essentially a redesigned Robin, not much to say to be honest. The Mark III, 1999 to 2000, another facelift this time with Vauxhall Corsa headlights. It was also the last car Reliant manufactured, and the last 65 Robins produced came in gold with everything top spec. The Robin became the second most popular fiberglass car in history. The Rialto. To be honest, pretty much an update to the Robin, or just a different version of it. It was manufactured between 1982 and 1997 and had a reworked 850cc engine for better performance. The Rialto SE became Reliant's best-selling model. Bond Bug, 1970 to 1974. Pretty much a sportier freewheeler, but in reality a Regal underneath. Now onto four wheels, and oddly, Reliant, despite common belief, didn't just make three-wheelers, but actually had more four-wheel vehicles than three-wheeled ones in its history. Reliant Sabre, or Sabra Sport, 1961 to 1963. Developed in collaboration with Autocars of Israel, with design by Reliant and assembly by Autocar, and becoming what I suspect is likely the first and only Israeli sports car. The Sabre made an impact in Israel due to the government's favouring of them, and they were given as gifts to military officers and high-up civil servants. As well as the use of Triumph and Ford engines bumped up their value a bit. In Britain, however, they made little impact. Despite entering into the Alpine Rally, the RAC Rally, the Welsh Rally and the Monte Carlo Rally, only 208 of both the Sabre and updated Sabre 6 were built. The Sabre had a 1703cc Ford Consul engine and a top speed of 90 miles per hour. The Sabre 6 had a 6-cylinder Ford engine of 2,553cc and a top speed of 110 miles per hour. Scimitar. Arguably the most iconic of Reliant's four-wheeled ventures, the Scimitar was always compared to the Ford Capri, but in fact it actually predates it by 4 years, proving that Reliant was no backwater operation. Now, to be honest, there are so many versions of this it would take a video in its own right, but if we take the top spec, 3.0 litre Ford Essex V6, we get a top speed of 121 miles per hour and a 0 to 60 in 8.5 seconds. It's also arguably one of the most iconic shooting brake GT cars ever made. However, once again, Reliant was let down with production rate, as over a 22-year production, only about 11,585 of these were made, with an extra 78 under license, bumping it up to 11,663. It's arguably the best car Reliant ever rolled out. The Rebel, 1964 to 1974. The Rebel, if taken on by a company like Austin or Morris, would have likely become a major staple of British motoring, alongside the other small cars of the Mini and the Imp. The Rebel was pretty popular despite its small production batch of only 2,600. It was the first of Reliant's creations to get an estate and van conversion, which in turn led to the trotter van in the Regal. Also, hilariously, it was much cheaper in tax to buy a van, so Reliant offered a DIY conversion kit to the estate from any dealer. You literally had to saw the sides out and put windows in. Top of the range, it had a 748cc engine, and they also made a GT prototype that actually outperformed the Scimitar. FW5 or Anadol A1, 1966 to 1975. The FW5 is a prototype Reliant built for Anadolu cars of Turkey, and it became Turkey's second domestically built car. It was also meant to be New Zealand's first domestically produced car, but plans fell through. It became Turkey's first rally car and is apparently legendary over there. Interestingly, despite going it alone after the A1, like Autocars of Israel, they kept the fiberglass in their future projects. It had a 1,297cc engine and a top speed of 87 miles per hour. Reliant Kitten, 1975 to 1982. The Kitten is clearly the son of the Rebel, and is also clearly just a Robin on four wheels, as you can see from the back. It had an 848cc engine and a top speed of 80 miles per hour. It was also assembled in India under license as the Sipani Dolphin, and they used the Kitten's design in future projects. It also became an Indian rally car. FW11. The Reliant FW11 was a prototype built by Reliant and styled by Baton for Otosan of Turkey. Although due to its electric windows and other innovations it was deemed too expensive. This led to it becoming over time the Citroën BX, which became one of Citroën's best-selling cars at over 2 million units sold. Reliant Fox. I mentioned earlier that Robins and Ants were built under license by MEBEA. Well, this time the roles were switched with MEBEA, yet they have no company name, that was their company name, doesn't stand for anything, taking a Kitten and beefing it up a bit with a better weight resistance, making essentially a small pickup truck, van or estate. Once again, this is due to a bit of dodgy loophole jerry-rigging, and Reliant was brought into the fold as in Greece at the time, foreign partnerships got cheaper taxes, and due to other joint collaborations, Reliant was an obvious choice. Both Reliant and MEBEA joint developed the Fox to completion. It was built in Greece from 1979 to 1983, however, due to a law change which increased the tax price, it was then built in the UK until 1990. The last car on this list is the more modern version of the Scimitar, as the older design kept being produced throughout Reliant's history. It had multiple versions, which are the SS1, SST and Sabre. Top spec, it had a 1.8 litre Nissan CA18ET turbocharged engine. GM in 1988 took interest and put some funding in for a concept car called the SS2, but then they pulled out. Reliant didn't just build fiberglass cars, they also built sinks, kitchen worktops, replacement plastic wind mirrors, guttering, which does mean somewhere out there in the Midlands, someone's guttering shares its DNA with the Reliant Robin, British rail train carriage body panels, aircraft bodies, Ford Transit high roof vans and Ford lorry cabs. They also taught Vauxhall how to make the body of their fiberglass car, the Chevette. These men in a shed in Stafford, making arguably one of the most mocked cars in history, became leading experts on fiberglass car manufacture. Forget Lotus, TVR, Gilban, Ginetta, you name it, any car built with fiberglass after roughly I'd say 1960 owes part of its production process to Reliant. In fact, the legendary Ford RS200 rally car that dominated 1980s Group B rallying too owes part of its DNA to Reliant, as they produced its body shell and panels. Here's a couple of pictures. I'll just go through this like a slideshow, you know, that's how it works, you know. Anyway. Also, a bonus piece of trivia I found is that the Bond Bug chassis and engine were used on the Star Wars Land Speeder, which essentially means that the Trotter van and the Star Wars Land Speeder are essentially just the same thing with different cases. It's just mad. So at this point, you're probably thinking Reliant sounds like a pretty competent car company. Why aren't they around anymore? Well, without getting into too much detail, there's a myriad of reasons. The first reason is production rates. Reliant made good cars that probably would have gone on to become dominant staples like the Rebel and the Scimitar. However, just by sheer production rates alone, there is no way they could meet demand to properly make some profit on these cars. If Volkswagen had made the Beetle and then decided to hand make it in a shed, it wouldn't have got to 21 million units sold, and the same can be said of Reliant. Secondly, size. Reliant was small, very small. They essentially worked out of a couple of sheds. But despite this, in the 1970s, it was the second largest British-owned UK car manufacturer, due to the sheer size of the behemoth that was British Leyland. And obviously with size, funds come into play. For instance, the Mini, despite being a best-selling car, for every car sold, British Leyland was selling them at a loss of £30, which is about £600, and well into the 70s the Mini was still being sold at a loss. Reliant, on the other hand, stayed in profit throughout. However, it wasn't like BL, too big to fail without government bailouts. Thirdly, Reliant had, to put it nicely, always had a more liberal attitude with loopholes and tax dodging than other companies would admit to, which explains the DIY estate conversion kits and Greek tax law shenanigans. However, Reliant essentially was struck a death blow in 2001 when the European Union closed the loophole allowing a motorcyclist to drive on a freewheeler. It comes as no surprise therefore that Reliant died in 2002. However, I have to add that they had essentially been avoiding bankruptcy since the mid-90s and had already gone under multiple times. Today they still exist, but as a parts supplier. Another problem is the decline of mining in the UK, which is where Reliant got most of their customers for its most popular models, which were the freewheelers. Another large problem or sticking point is that Reliant produced very niche vehicles. Their main customer base was miners, and any other cars they produced had effectively cheaper counterparts, like the Ford Capri to the Scimitar and the Mini Metro to the Rialto. Secondly, at this point most people just got a full driver's license, and another problem is that their main cars only really made sense in Britain. They didn't have a high profit margin like other small successful British shed/hand-built marques, with sports cars like TVR, Ginetta, Gilbert and McLaren, but they also had no prestige in hand-built sports cars like Morgan or brand recognition. Lastly though, and biggest of all, was the car industry in Britain, aka British Leyland, was essentially destroyed by strikes, bad management, poor quality and poor design, and the arrogance that Brits would buy British and that BL was too big to fail. This led to British cars being badly made and, to put it nicely, a bit shit. As well as of course production costs and the inherent idea of everyone at British Leyland that the government would bail them out despite the fact they never updated their cars. For instance, the Mini was produced from 1959 to 2000 and was essentially never updated. For example, here's a 1979 BMW, and here is a 1979 Jaguar. Now, here is a 1990s BMW, and here is a 1990s Jaguar. You can clearly see not much has changed. In the end, BMW would come to own Rolls-Royce, Mini and Triumph. Tata would come to own Jaguar and Land Rover. Volkswagen owns Bentley, and the Chinese own MG and Rover. Lastly, and arguably most importantly, they were only really known for their freewheeled vehicles, and unfortunately never broke that mould. In the end, we can all agree that Reliant got dealt a bad hand, innovating and producing reliable hand-built cars with no government support, versus British Leyland, a train wreck of a clusterfuck, bailed out relentlessly. Reliant was constantly the source of a joke, despite producing vehicles that have survived long after its siblings at British Leyland have rusted away. When that factory closed in 2002, we didn't just lose a company, we lost a company of experts in fiberglass and producing economical and lightweight cars, something we desperately will need in the 21st century. Maybe some of the money that the government threw at British Leyland to produce abominations such as the Allegro, Princess and City Rover could have been thrown at Reliant, because I think it's fair to say that despite their limitations they punched well above their weight, and were definitely bigger than the Robin. But in the end, like with most things, the rest is history, and we can only reminisce on better days.
This This then is the world of Reliant, a specialist manufacturer making its products for special people.